There is a patch of forest in South America that, for a long time, contained exactly one human being, not one family, not one small band of survivors clinging to each other in the green dark. One person. A single man, alone, inside a stretch of jungle roughly the size of a small country, surrounded on every side by land that had been cleared, burned, fenced, and settled by people who did not speak his language, did not know his name, and had in one way or another taken almost everything from him. He built himself a house with a deep pit inside it, wide as a grave, and no one ever fully understood why. He dug more than 80 of these strange, deep holes throughout the territory he moved across during his life, and to this day nobody living can say for certain what they were for. A trap, some said. A place to hide, said others. A place to listen for footsteps in the earth, said a few, though this explanation is the hardest to prove and the easiest to imagine. He was seen only a handful of times across more than 2.5 decades. He was filmed only once, for a few brief seconds, swinging an axe into a tree with the calm, practiced motion of someone who had done the same motion 10,000 times before and expected to do it 10,000 times again. His face in that footage shows no fear. It shows the particular blankness of a person who has stopped expecting anything from strangers, because every time strangers had come before, something had been lost. This is the story of that man. Or as much of it as can be told, because so much of what happened to him took place in silence, deep in trees that do not keep records, in years that left almost no trace except a scattering of arrowheads, a line of hollowed palm thatch roofs slowly collapsing into moss, and 80-some holes in the ground that still to this day no one can fully explain settle in. This will be a slow story, and there is no need to rush through it. Let your eyes close if they want to. The forest waited 26 years for this man. It can wait a little longer for you to fall asleep. To understand how one man came to live entirely alone, you first have to understand what surrounded him, because his solitude was not a choice made in a vacuum. It was carved into shape by the land around him, and the land around him by the late 20th century had become one of the most violently contested strips of earth in the entire Amazon basin. The region sits in the western part of Brazil, near the border with Bolivia, in a state whose name, for the purposes of this story, matters less than what happened inside it. It is a place of dense, humid lowland forest, threaded by slow brown rivers, home to jaguars, tapirs, armadillos, and scattered across it in small, mobile bands, a number of indigenous peoples who had lived there for generations beyond counting, many of whom had never sustained contact with the outside world at all. In the 1970s and 1980s, that began to change, and it changed quickly, and it changed violently. Ranchers arrived first, pushing cattle herds into land that had never held fences. Then loggers came behind them, cutting mahogany and other valuable hardwoods and hauling them out on newly built roads. Where there is unclaimed, uncatalogued forest and unprotected people living inside it, there is often also, tragically, profit to be made in clearing both away. And so, across this stretch of borderland, indigenous communities that had survived for centuries inside the trees began to be pushed, burned, shot at, and in more than one documented case, simply erased. It is worth sitting with that word for a moment. Erased, not relocated, not assimilated. Erased, meaning that in some cases, entire small communities of people, families with names and songs and specific ways of tying a roof together, were killed in raids carried out by hired men working for landowners who wanted the forest cleared of anyone who might slow down a bulldozer. Government investigators who later looked into the violence in this particular region found evidence, though incomplete and difficult to fully verify decades later, that at least one small group of indigenous people was targeted directly in the early 1990s. Witnesses spoke of an attack, of gunfire in the trees, of a group of perhaps 6 people who had been living together, reduced in the space of a single violent incident to almost nothing. Some accounts say there was one survivor. A man alone, we do not know his name. This is one of the strangest and saddest facts of this entire story. Human being lived for 26 years inside a patch of forest, was tracked, filmed, studied, and eventually mourned by strangers on the other side of the world. And no one, not the government agents who monitored him from a careful distance, not the journalists who wrote about him, not the small circle of forest guardians who considered protecting him one of the great quiet purposes of their working lives, ever learned what he called himself. He was given names by others. The most common one translates roughly to man of the hole, a reference to the pits he dug throughout his territory, though it is an odd kind of name to carry, being defined by an object rather than by anything about who he actually was. It is the name that stuck in news reports and government files. It is the name in the absence of any other that this story will use, though it should be said clearly, this was never a name he gave himself. It was a name given to a mystery by people trying to describe a mystery, and it says more about how little was known than about the man himself. He likely had another name once. A real one, spoken by people who loved him in a language that may now be extinct, since it is possible, even likely, that he was the last living speaker of it. If that is true, then somewhere in the final years of his life, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon or the quiet hours before dawn, the very last word of an entire human language may have been spoken aloud by a single voice, in a hut with a deep pit inside it, with no one else on earth able to understand it. That thought is worth sitting with, too. What is known or believed with reasonable confidence by the researchers who eventually pieced together fragments of his life is this. Sometime around 1995, government agents from Brazil's Indigenous Protection Agency began finding signs of a person living alone in the forest of this particular territory. Empty huts. Cleared gardens with corn and manioc growing in neat, deliberate rows. Someone was planting food, tending it, harvesting it, and then, for reasons unknown, abandoning the plot and moving somewhere else entirely. At first, officials assumed there might still be a small surviving group. A family, perhaps, moving together and simply avoiding contact. The way many uncontacted or recently contacted peoples reasonably choose to do after generations of violence at the hands of outsiders. It took years of patient, careful tracking, following trails, examining abandoned shelters, counting hammocks strung inside huts, counting the number of sleeping places, counting the number of tools, before the agents responsible for the region came to a conclusion that none of them wanted to reach. There was only one hammock. There was only one set of footprints, over and over in different clearings at different times, always alone. Somewhere in the mid-1990s, an entire people had been reduced, through violence that has never been fully accounted for in any courtroom, to a single surviving man walking through the forest by himself, planting gardens for a family that no longer existed, sleeping in huts built for more people than would ever again lie down inside them. Picture it, if you can, slowly, the way it likely unfolded rather than the way a headline would compress it. A man in his 20s or 30s, his exact age was never confirmed, only estimated based on the wear on his teeth and the condition of remains found decades later, wakes to the sound of something wrong. Not the ordinary wrongness of the forest, the calls of birds that mean a jaguar is near, or the silence that means rain is coming. A different wrongness. human voices that do not belong to his family. The particular crack of a gunshot, a sound the forest does not produce on its own. We do not know exactly what he did in that moment, and it would be irresponsible to invent details that no one can verify. But we know, because of what came after, that he survived, and that in surviving he lost what appears to have been everyone he had ever known. There is no ceremony for a loss like that. No neighboring village to mourn with him, because his people were, by all evidence, already isolated from other indigenous groups in the region, protective of their own separateness in the way that many small, deliberately uncontacted communities are, precisely because contact had so often meant disease, violence, or both. So he did the only thing that made sense to a person raised entirely inside a forest, with no other framework for what comes next. He kept living the way he had been taught to live. He built a new hut. He planted a new garden. He hunted and gathered and wove and dug and moved his camp when the soil grew thin or the game grew scarce, exactly as he would have done if there had still been 6 or 10 or 20 people around him to share the work and the food and the long, quiet evenings. He simply did all of it alone for the next 26 years. Let's slow down here and talk about what that actually meant day to day, because the phrase alone for 26 years is one of those sentences that is easy to say and almost impossible to actually picture. 26 years is not a single long night. It is roughly 9,500 individual sunrises. It is 9,500 mornings in which a person wakes up, and there is no one to say good morning to. 9,500 separate moments in which the body, out of pure animal habit, might turn toward where another sleeping person would be and find nothing there. It is somewhere around 130 seasons of rain and dry weather, cycling through again and again, the forest turning wet and swollen, then dry and cracked, then wet again. An entire lifetime of weather experienced with no one to comment on it, no one to say the rains are late this year, no one to remember, the way families do, that the rains had also been late 3 years before and the year before that. It is somewhere around 312 full moons, rising over a canopy with only one set of eyes watching them. Researchers who study extreme isolation, polar explorers who winter alone, sailors on long solo voyages, hermits who choose solitude deliberately, often describe something that happens to the mind after long enough without human contact. Time changes shape. Days blur into each other in some ways and stretch unbearably in others. Some people begin talking to themselves simply to hear a human voice, even their own. Some begin naming objects or trees or tools, giving them small identities simply so that something in their world can be addressed rather than simply used. We do not know if the man in this story did any of these things. We can only guess, based on what we know of human minds under conditions like this, and based on the small, strange details his camps left behind, details that suggest, more than almost anything else, a mind that was still working, still building, still solving problems, still in its own way alive and reaching for something. Those 80-some holes are the strangest detail of all and worth returning to slowly. Each one was deep, some more than 4 meters, and narrow, dug with what would have been enormous, sustained physical effort, using tools no more sophisticated than sharpened wood and stone. Several were found beneath the floors of his huts, hidden under palm thatch, concealed in a way that suggests they were meant to be discovered only by him, or perhaps by no one at all. When investigators eventually found human and animal remains at the bottom of one such hole, a theory began to take shape that has become, over time, the leading explanation, though it is still ultimately a guess. Some researchers believe the pits were used for hunting, dug in game trails and camouflage to trap tapirs or other large animals that might fall through the thin covering and become caught below, providing a source of meat that a single hunter working entirely alone could manage without the help of a group. A single hunter cannot easily chase down a running animal, corner it, and kill it safely by himself the way a group of hunters can. A pit trap requires only patience and the willingness to dig and wait and return. Other researchers have offered a different theory, one that is impossible to prove but strangely moving to consider, that the pits may also have served at least sometimes as a place of refuge, a place a single permanently wary man could climb into and hide, deep enough that someone walking past above might never notice him crouched in the dark beneath their feet, waiting, breathing quietly for the danger to pass. If that theory is even partly correct, then those 80 holes represent something almost unbearably poignant. A man who had already lost everyone he loved to violence from outsiders, spending decades of his life digging again and again into the earth itself, building himself small chambers of safety in a world that had given him every reason to believe safety could only ever be temporary, and had to be redug over and over wherever he went. He moved often. Government trackers who studied his abandoned camps over the years carefully, respectfully, almost always from a distance, guided by a policy that prioritized his right to be left alone above almost anything else, found that he rarely stayed in one location for more than a few years before relocating, sometimes only a short distance, sometimes much farther. Each new camp followed a similar pattern. A cleared area modest in size. A hut constructed from palm thatch, built low and snug, its structure showing clear evidence of skilled, practiced craftsmanship. This was not the shelter of someone improvising for the first time, but of someone who had built dozens of huts across a lifetime and knew exactly how to weave a roof that would hold against rain for years. Nearby, almost always a small garden. Corn, manioc, papaya, bananas. Planted in careful rows, tended over months, sometimes harvested only partially before he moved on, leaving fruit to ripen and fall and rot on branches that no one would ever pick from again. It is one of the more mysterious and moving details of his life. He kept planting, kept tending, kept doing the long, patient work of agriculture, work that by its very nature assumes a future, assumes that someone will come back to this spot in 6 months, assumes there is a reason to invest labor now for a harvest later, even though there was no family to share the harvest with, and even though he so often moved on before the harvest was fully complete. Perhaps this was simply habit, deeply ingrained, the way any of us might keep setting 2 coffee cups on the counter out of muscle memory long after the second person is gone. Perhaps it was something more deliberate, a way of maintaining a connection to a way of life, a way of being human, that he refused to let violence take from him entirely. Perhaps it was both at different times on different mornings, depending on how the light fell through the canopy and how the loneliness happened to sit on him that particular day. He also made arrows, and he made them beautifully. Investigators who found his abandoned tools over the years described arrowheads carved with a level of craftsmanship that spoke of deep, practiced skill, sharp, symmetrical, clearly made by hands that had made hundreds before them, hands taught by someone at some point long before the violence, in a tradition passed down the way such traditions always are. An older relative sitting beside a younger one, showing, correcting, showing again, patient repetition across many afternoons, until the skill became as natural as breathing. Whoever taught him to make those arrowheads is almost certainly among the people who did not survive whatever happened to his community. And so every arrow he carved for the rest of his life carried inside it a kind of inheritance, a skill passed from a hand that was gone into a hand that remained, used again and again across 26 solitary years, a quiet, ongoing act of memory that required no words at all. There is something in this worth pausing on. We often think of memory as something spoken or written or photographed, but there are other ways to remember a person. You can remember them in the shape your hands make when you do something they once taught you. You can remember them every single time you do that thing without ever once having to say their name out loud, because the doing itself is the remembering. He may have made and used many hundreds of arrows across those 26 years. Which means he may have quietly, wordlessly remembered his teacher many hundreds of times. Contact, on the rare occasions it happened, did not go well, though did not go well undersells the depth of what those encounters must have meant to him. In 1996, agents attempting to establish peaceful contact, hopping in part to offer him medical care, protection, and the option of relocating to a community of other indigenous survivors, managed a brief, tense meeting. He was described as guarded, unwilling to be approached closely, communicating almost nothing before withdrawing back into the trees. A more violent encounter is believed to have occurred at some point in the years that followed, one that nearly cost him his life. He was found at one point with an old injury, a wound consistent with a gunshot, healed over the years into a permanent scar across his torso, evidence that at some point during his decades alone, someone had tried and nearly succeeded in killing the very last member of his people. Think about the particular cruelty embedded in that fact. This was a man who had already survived the destruction of his entire community by outside violence. And at some later point, alone, unable to call for help from anyone, with no family left to tend a wound or sit beside him through fever, he survived being shot as well. We do not know who did it, or exactly when, or what became of the people responsible. The forest in this story keeps almost as many secrets as the man himself. For the government agency responsible for his protection, the policy that eventually took shape was, in its own quiet way, one of the most respectful and unusual approaches to a single human life that any government agency has ever adopted. Leave him alone, not out of neglect. The opposite. A demarcated territory, more than 8,000 hectares of protected forest, was set aside specifically to preserve his right to live exactly as he chose, without pressure to assimilate, without pressure to accept contact, without pressure to explain himself to anyone. Agents monitored the territory from a distance, checking periodically that loggers and ranchers were not encroaching, that his camps remained undisturbed, that he was, as far as could be told without ever directly asking him, alive and continuing to live on his own terms. For years, that distant, careful watching was the only relationship he had with the outside world. Agents would find a new camp, note that it appeared occupied, observe smoke risen.